Although I've used Zoom to round up my kids and grandkids in one virtual room, this is the first time I've used it to address a virtual audience. So it's hard to get into it a little bit, but I guess we'll get right down to the story of Franklin Roosevelt, Donald Trump, Craigslist, and the shabby state of America's news media. My reason for choosing this topic is that I lived most of it. For 40 years, I committed serial journalism. I started on the Providence Journal in 1970, down to the story of, then jumped to the Baltimore Sun, where I spent the next 34 years. After that, I was an editor on a medical news website, and finally a producer for a talk show on public radio here in Baltimore. I'm up north now. Now, some of you may be asking how I can even mention FDR and Donald Trump in the same breath. Well, they have several important things in common. Dick, if you could flip a slide for me. They're first New Yorkers, and that means they have that much in common. They also come from wealthy families, which is the next slide. They've also shared the same address in Washington, which is the next slide. And for the purposes of this discussion, Roosevelt and Trump both used a disruptive new technology to deliver their messages, and they delivered them directly to the American people without a hostile press corps as a go-between. FDR saw this possibility in radio, which at that point was the most disruptive communications technology since Gutenberg invented the printing press. The first commercial radio station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, had only been broadcasting for 13 years. In fact, its owner chose Election Day of 1920 to go on the air so that he could report Warren Harding's victory to thousands of listeners hours before the newspapers hit the streets. Newspapers, sadly, need fleets of trucks and an army of street vendors and newsboys on bicycles to deliver information to one reader at a time. Radio signals operate at the speed of light to reach their entire audience simultaneously. They're limited only by the power of their transmitter and the rules set down by what was then a brand new Federal Communications Commission. The FCC's job was to assign frequencies and limit the broadcast footprint of each station to a fairly small area and keep it from stepping on another station's broadcast. But by 1933, there were already competing networks of hundreds of radio stations that could effectively transmit the same programming from coast to coast. That turned the entire nation into a single audience. Roosevelt used this network to talk directly to the American people using an informal style that he called the fireside chat. He used these chats to promote what was then a really radical agenda to lift the nation out of the Depression. He called it the New Deal. There was no middleman. His voice carried directly to Americans in their homes and workplaces without the filter of hostile reporters and Republican news editors. Most Republicans consider Roosevelt to be a traitor to his class. The new networks also set a precedent by giving the president free time to promote his legislative agenda. This may not have been strictly idealism on their part. Roosevelt appointed the FCC's commissioners, and without an FCC license, stations couldn't broadcast, and without broadcasting, they couldn't make money. No president had ever enjoyed this kind of instant communication technology before, and over time, as the penetration of radio grew, it worked in his favor. Roosevelt's successors also used radio and later television to speak directly to the Americans in their living rooms and workplaces. They had varying degrees of impact. Now we'll fast forward 83 years from Roosevelt's fireside chats to another president with a radical agenda and a hostile press corps. But for his end run around the press, Donald Trump chose a medium no one had even dreamed about in Roosevelt's day, the internet, and an application with the innocuous name of Twitter. Now, the internet is unlike newspapers, radio, and television in one critical feature. It's completely interactive. The traditional media could only communicate in one direction, out. But on the World Wide Web, every computer can theoretically communicate in both directions with every other computer. That's because our PCs, tablets, and cell phones on the internet have a numeric address. Sometimes you even see it. It's called an IP address, and it looks something like 198.43.5.48. On the web, there are computers that translate these numbers into words such as google.com, and likewise translate the other way so that you can type in google.com and it will find 193.43.5.48. Unlike Roosevelt, who felt bound by convention and good manners, Trump was bound by neither. He turned his tweets into a bizarre stream of consciousness. It's frequently filled with conspiracy theories, personal invective, and outright fabrications, which have his assistants talking about alternative facts. Trump has been known to tweet as many as 90 times before breakfast. He uses Twitter to argue, brag, cajole, and launch personal assaults on his critics, modulated only by the fact that Twitter limits its users to 280 characters per tweet. Some say this is a perfect match for the president's attention span. According to the Washington Post, Trump's personal and White House Twitter accounts have more than 80 million followers. So regardless of the truth or incivility of his tweets, traditional media and other media on the web feel obliged to report at least some of them, noting their flaws. Meanwhile, Trump-friendly bloggers and social media retweet Trump's raw output. So no matter how far-fetched it is, millions more hear it because other people are repeating it. The internet makes everyone a potential broadcaster, and without the need for a license or an expensive transmitter. Most responsible news outlets, and there are a few remaining, now identify what they believe are the lies and misinformation in Trump's tweets. Congress has even called the CEOs of the largest social media companies on the carpet for what they see as a willingness to spread lies and misinformation without informing readers that what they're seeing may have no connection to reality. Even Twitter has reluctantly agreed to brand Trump's most outrageous tweets as questionable. Just last week, Facebook and Twitter removed a Trump message alleging that the coronavirus doesn't infect children, while everyone knows that it's just the opposite. Even minimal skepticism feeds Trump's inherent paranoia and fear of the press, which sends him right back to the tweet machine, creating an endless loop of what I can only think of as Twitter litter. It's definitely not the kind of creative political discussion that the internet's utopian pioneers were planning on. Like FDR, Trump uses the new medium to appeal directly to his base. Ironically, those Trumpians have a lot in common with the hard luck, unemployed workers and farmers that Roosevelt addressed in his fireside chats. However, if you listen to recordings of Roosevelt's chats, you'll notice that they're delivered in a low-key, confident, upbeat tone, appealing to what he saw as voters' better natures, their common hopes, their resilience, and their native optimism. If you read Trump's tweets, you'll hear a president appealing to the grievances, fear, racism, xenophobia, and paranoia of his dedicated supporters, as well as vicious personal attacks on those who disagree. So, while their messages and style may be different, Roosevelt and Trump demonstrated the same grasp of new technology in their first terms, and it often worked in their favor. Whether Trump can tweet his way to a second term, and that may be his only medium if the pandemic keeps crowds from gathering, remains to be seen. So, having dispensed with Roosevelt and Trump, I'd like to spend a few minutes describing my own newsroom experiences, which explain why I describe the state of today's news media as shabby. The dictionary defines shabby in two ways. With regard to objects, it means in poor condition, through long or hard use or lack of care. With regard to behavior, it means shameful. In today's media, I see both. But for the first 25 years on the job, I had the advantage of a medium that was at its zenith. I quit when I realized that the joy of creating a daily newspaper was outweighed by budget cuts, layoff threats, and a creeping disregard for the values that were drilled into me when I wrote the first stories for my college newspaper 55 years ago. During a long and checkered career as a reporter and editor, I covered government at every level, ranging from towns of 1,500 souls to the Maryland State House to Capitol Hill. I also worked as a feature writer, rewrite man, and newsroom computer guru. In addition to the daily crime beat, which every young reporter covers, my assignments included education, transportation, the census, elections, science, technology, and health. I had 5 years as the bureau chief in Baltimore County, our largest circulation area, as well as several years as the state news editor. At various times, I organized public opinion polls on a variety of subjects, ranging from voting preferences to readers' sex habits. You can guess which one of those was more fun. We asked people whether they'd changed their sex habits because of age, and believe it or not, we had the highest response rate of any of the 20 polls that I supervised. The one thing you can't get people to talk about is money, but if you ask them about sex, they'll go on forever. In the normal course of business, I interviewed governors, congressmen, car thieves, demolition derby drivers, bishops, senators, bank robbers, murderers, test pilots, priests and rabbis, astronauts and strippers, casino operators, and Nobel Prize winners. Besides government, my beats included education, transportation, 2 sentences, science, medicine, and technology. Thanks to a Radio Shack computer that hooked up to a TV set and help from a friendly genius whose day job was so classified he couldn't talk about it, I became one of the profession's first telecommuters. That meant I could do my reporting during the day and then write stories at home and send them to the Sun's computer system. And that meant I could spend more time with my 2 young sons and less time behind the wheel. I also learned a little bit about programming, thanks to my friendly genius and a Radio Shack manual designed for bright 12-year-olds. I could actually understand some of that, and surprisingly, I enjoyed it. Unlike your kids, a computer will always do what you tell it to do. That may not be what you want it to do, but that's your problem. In any case, at the advanced age of 35, I became a computer nerd. And like Dick Lechner, who just waited an additional 35 years to start, he does it. I hope I've done it well. I'm really impressed by how much Dick has learned in such a short time. Now, most newsrooms operate under the principle that knowing anything about an arcane subject makes you the expert. So one day my boss drafted me onto a team that was installing a new $7 million publishing system that would serve about 300 users. To me, it was the equivalent of asking a bicycle mechanic to build a Maserati from a mail order kit. But blissfully unaware of my ignorance, I dug in, I wrote typesetting and communication software, doctored staff PCs so that other reporters could enjoy the same remote access I had. And I figured I must have done 100 of those over the years. And I also set up a communication system that was one of the few that worked after China shut down the satellites during the Tiananmen massacre. After 5 years, I was tired of the midnight calls for help, and my boss kindly paroled me back into the regular news staff. But the technology experience paid off. The Evening Sun was one of the first newspapers to use PCs and public databases for investigations and analysis of subjects that included school test scores, public opinion, election results, census data, gun crimes, defense spending, homicides, vacant houses, and one of my favorites, the names people give their dogs. You may not know it, but there's a dog license database in every county, and it's public information. So we learned that the most common canine was a Labrador Retriever named Max. Believe it or not, we did not find a single dog named Spot or Rover. Without these early PCs, which were crude and underpowered by today's standards, these projects would have taken months, if not years, instead of a week or two. Many of them wouldn't have been possible at all. Computer-assisted reporting eventually became a recognized specialty in the newsroom. The numbers, charts, and interactive graphics tracking the spread of COVID-19 that you see every day in newspapers and on the web are the direct successors of the efforts pioneered by the first generation of newsroom geeks, almost none of whom had any computer training. I take some comfort in the New York Times, which is using its considerable newsroom technology to poll every state every day to create a national database of COVID cases. I'm convinced it will keep politicians from the president on down from fudging the numbers so the pandemic looks less dangerous than it is. Once I returned to the newsroom, I produced a standalone weekly technology section for 5 years, then spent 5 more editing a weekly health and science section. As a sideline, I wrote a weekly computer column for 2 decades that appeared in papers around the country, as well as freelance pieces for Fortune magazine and other outlets. But all good things come to an end, and when I saw the newspaper business imploding, I took a buyout before they could fire me. Had I waited a few months, I would have been frog marched out the door with 60 other editors on the staff. And one baseball writer who got a call in the middle of a game telling him not to come back to the building. Luckily, I landed as an editor on a medical news website that caters to doctors and hypochondriacs. It has a virtual newsroom of reporters and editors who are spread all over the country and communicated by passing Microsoft Word documents around and around and around. At the boss's request, I put on my old hat and found an inexpensive newsroom publishing system that brought us into the 21st century. Meanwhile, I learned that working from home wasn't as pleasant as I thought it would be, especially as a full-time job. I'm a social person, and the buzz of the newsroom always kept me charged up. At home, I began to feel like I was chained to a computer in solitary confinement in my basement all day. I finally quit the job out of sheer boredom. My last gig was helping a friend from the Sun who did a daily talk show on our local public radio station. He hired me part-time to read the books written by the authors he interviewed. He didn't have time to read them, so I did it and provided him with a homemade version of Cliff's Notes. You remember those from high school. I also provided scripts for his on-air introductions, as well as lists of questions to structure the interview. Thus armed, my friend was able to conduct an intelligent conversation for an hour without having read the book himself. The authors often praised him for his detailed knowledge. He just smiled and said, "Thank you." Meanwhile, I absorbed a treasure trove of useless cocktail party knowledge that my wife no longer finds amusing. When my talk radio show host signed his last college tuition check in 2016, he said sayonara to the radio and called it quits, and I did too. I've been practicing creative loafing for most of the last 4 years. When people ask me what I did at the newspaper, I think about my byline file, which has a couple of thousand clips, and a box of yellowing health and technology sections that total about 2,000 pages in all. And then with some degree of pride, I can say that over 3.5 decades in this business, I killed a lot of trees. And when people ask me why I chose journalism in the first place, I tell them it sure beat working for a living. So how does my experience fit into an address about the shabby state of the American media? Well, being Jewish, I like to answer a question with another question. How many of you have ever heard of a fellow named Craig Newmark? Don't see many hands out there. Craig is a talented programmer who thought it would be cool to build a website where people could buy and sell things online for free. So he set up what became the first national classified advertising system with nodes in 700 cities around the country. Craigslist is arguably the ugliest site on the web because he didn't want to waste money or computer cycles on fancy graphics. But his site does exactly what he intended, with minimum fuss. It also illustrates the law of unintended consequences. Basically, Craigslist stole one of the newspaper industry's top sources of revenue, those little 3-line classified ads that added up to millions of dollars every year and were more profitable than the full-page ads from department stores and automobile dealers. Where newspapers charged readers by the line, Craigslist charges most advertisers nothing at all. So we found ourselves competing with someone who was giving away what we were selling. You just can't do it. In fact, Craigslist is a better product than ours in many ways because sellers can use as many words as they need to describe their offering and even post photos. In a newspaper, that would have been prohibitively expensive if you were just trying to get rid of an old lawnmower. Craigslist had another advantage. Newspapers are highly localized. If you're buying or selling something that you can mail or ship, you can advertise in any of Craigslist's 700 cities. Another blind side to our industry came from eBay, which added yet another wrinkle to person-to-person sales, online auctions. It guaranteed payment to the seller and receipt of the merchandise to the buyer. It also gave buyers and sellers a tool to rate their experiences with one another, and it turned thousands of people who prowl yard sales and flea markets into entrepreneurs, some of whom actually make a living at it. Like Craigslist, eBay serves a national market. When the steel frame on my favorite swivel chair broke after 30 years and couldn't be replaced, I was able to find the identical make and model listed in Arizona under Vintage Furniture. It cost $70 above my winning bid to ship it to Baltimore, but I'm still enjoying that chair. There weren't all that many available, and there was no way I could have found one quickly in any other medium. Monster.com, the internet help site, hijacked another major source of cash for newspapers, employment ads. These ran in the classified section of the Sunday paper and brought in top dollar. Once again, it did a better job than we did. It allowed job seekers and employers to search the whole country and even allowed applicants to send resumes online. By the time newspapers got into the game with their own employment sites, Monster.com and the other help wanted pages had already snatched away most of the business. Now we'll talk about the really bad news. Circulation. There was a rule of thumb that circulation revenue from subscriptions and street sales would pay for the physical cost of printing the paper. When a massive 3-story press was running at top speed, it could produce 50,000 copies of a paper every hour in color. That turned out to be overkill. Daily newspaper circulation today is the same as it was in 1940, when the population of the US was about 132 million. Today, our population is 327 million. Do the math and you can figure out what happened to market penetration. 50 years ago, television, newspaper, and radio were the major providers of news. According to the Pew Research Center, TV is still the king, but internet and social media are closing in. Only 13% of Americans now get most of their local news from newspapers. That includes print and online versions. The traditional media once believed that advertising they lost in print or on the airwaves would return online. But that hasn't happened because there were too many online competitors waiting with very few barriers to entry. In 1970, the year I started at The Sun, total advertising and circulation revenue for all newspapers was the equivalent of $66 billion. That's in today's dollars. By 1918, that had dropped to an estimated $25 billion. In 2014, Google alone had almost 66 billion in ad revenue. Last year, it was 161 billion. During the same time frame, Facebook's income increased from $12.4 billion to almost 70 billion. Traditional news organizations, even online news services, get the scraps from the social media table. 50 years ago, the newspaper industry's profit margin was 40%, even with news staffs 3 to 4 times as large as they are now. Today, the profit margin is closer to 10%, if the paper's making money at all. TV news has fared better, but not much. According to Pew Research, when I left the Sun 12 years ago, newsroom employment was 71,000, and this was after years of cutbacks. By 2018, newsrooms had declined to 39,000. Some industry sources estimate that 40% of newspaper reporters have been fired since 2007. The Sun's news staff peaked at about 420 while I was there. Today it's closer to 120. Its national and foreign staffs, once a source of pride in a mid-sized paper, are gone. Where I once had a dozen people covering Baltimore County, our largest circulation area, 2 reporters now cover a population of 820,000 spread out over 680 square miles. Excuse me, my voice gets a little dry doing this. This sorry trend is reverberated in cities and towns across the country as cutbacks killed off everyday coverage of events and institutions such as city and town councils, school boards, and zoning boards. Knowing that a newspaper was peering over their shoulders helped keep the rascals at bay and made informed citizens out of readers. Not that there's any shortage of rascals, but they have no one to look after them now. Meanwhile, newspapers have become the targets of so-called vulture capitalists who snap them up cheaply, fire all but a handful of staff, and strip the company of its assets. My former colleagues in Baltimore are waiting for that to happen, but praying that several local nonprofits will get together, buy the newspaper, and run it as a nonprofit institution. Even in the good old days when profits were high, newspaper wages were embarrassingly low. Well into the 50s and 60s, that's the 1950s and 60s, reported was regarded as a Gentile blue-collar type of employment that promised some upward mobility for high school grads who could write simple sentences. But the image of the press in movies and TV once inspired the governor of Rhode Island to describe a press conference as 3 reporters in a room without a whiskey bottle. In reality, newspapers have been hiring college graduates for years, even Ivy Leaguers. Most were driven more by curiosity than greed. Then the bombshell hit. The Watergate scandal dethroned a president, and the movie about it, All the President's Men, showed how a pair of low-level reporters could bring down the highest office holder in the land. Journalism became more of a calling than a job, a fashionable career for for college grads who are not driven solely by greed and believed in the public's right to be informed. The business still doesn't pay well. In 2017, the Bureau of Labor Statistics said the median salary for US journalists was about $40,000 a year. This varied from $26,000 in Oklahoma to about $105,000 in New York. That's about equal in buying power. Few people will ever get rich in this business. Like school teachers, most journalists survived and raised families in middle-class surroundings by having working spouses. Teachers and reporters once earned similar salaries. Today, school teachers are far better off, according to US News and World Report. Their median salary is $57,000. But the media still had one great advantage in recruiting people. The work was interesting, it was unpredictable, it was often entertaining, and unlike many white-collar jobs, its rewards were immediate and tangible. At the end of an assignment, I could point to a story in the paper and say, I did that. Although being an editor involved more meetings and office politics, instead of pointing to a story, I could point to a whole section and say, we did that. At every level, there's a feeling of accomplishment. If you want to see a more timely view of this ethic, and you haven't already seen it, check out the movie Spotlight. It tells how the Boston Globe unearthed a long-running sex abuse scandal in the city's most sacred and powerful institution, the Roman Catholic Church. It's one of the most realistic depictions of what goes on in a newsroom that I've ever seen. As time went by and I could see the newspaper business just disintegrating, the list of casualties grew every day. In fact, about 1,800 newspapers have closed or merged in the US since 2004. Most of them were weeklies and small dailies, but there were some big names among them. The Cincinnati Post, the Green Bay Chronicle, and just up the road, the Tampa Tribune. The Boulder Daily Camera, based in one of the wealthiest and best educated cities in America, closed its doors in 2018. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer, likewise in a wealthy and educated community, has gone web only. The New York Daily News, the matriarch of tabloid journalism, and always fun to read, has laid off half its staff and now has 45 humans to cover a city of 8 million. The Naples Daily News was sold from the Scripps Howard chain, which had a pretty good reputation, to Gannett. And like all of Gannett's websites, it now looks and reads like USA Today. The loss of many small dailies and weeklies has produced what researchers at the University of North Carolina call news deserts, much like you hear about food deserts in the inner cities. These are mostly in rural areas where local government goes virtually uncovered. Studies show that in an area where papers have closed, the population grows less aware of and less involved with local, state, and national issues. So what do we have left today? A handful of good papers soldier on with enough income or backing to continue their print and online editions. The largest in terms of circulation is still the Wall Street Journal, which is considerably to the right of the New York Times and the Washington Post. But unlike the Post, and to a lesser extent the Times, the Journal hasn't forgotten the difference between reporting and opinion. It's the Dead Tree People paper that I read every day. All of these papers are protected by paywalls, which means you have to buy a subscription to read their stories. This has helped rescue the papers, and bailouts offer a good return for a few others. But people have to be willing to pay for the quality of the product that they produce. I forgot one paper in here. Probably the best paper in America that nobody reads is the Los Angeles Times, which suffers from being 3 hours behind its competitors in the East. So you just can't get it on your doorstep. To see the very best journalism in America, visit the Pulitzer Prize website or watch PBS. The real problem, however, is not the quality of the news, but the fact that there just isn't much left in the surviving papers or the variety of coverage that once existed. Foreign news staffs, once the goal of so many young reporters, have been decimated or disappeared entirely. Much of the reporting you see is now done by stringers, contractors, or in collaboration with nonprofits. I'm not trashing these stories wholesale. The problem is that you don't know whose agenda is behind them. Coverage of state and local issues has likewise suffered, with a very, very real effect on the American electorate that goes beyond just the general coarseness of political dialogue today. The routine coverage and investigative reporting that discouraged some of the rascals has been disappearing. The costs are very real. Finance professors at Notre Dame and the University of Illinois found that the closure of a local newspaper increases the cost of municipal borrowing in those cities. Now, what would they have to do with each other? I mean, I was really surprised when I read that. Well, The market knows that there are fewer watchdogs standing guard on public finances, and it shows when they have to pay a couple points more in interest rate on their bonds. Some see a ray of hope in nonprofit news organizations, such as ProPublica, Mother Jones, the International Reporting Program, and the Center for Public Integrity. Specialist organizations, such as the Kaiser Health News Service or Politico, are typically staffed by former reporters and editors from major newspapers or television stations that have downsized. Typically, they partner with talent-starved daily newspapers on major investigative projects. But there are few people in the business who believe that the nonprofit model can replace what's been lost. The most disheartening aspect of all of this, in my view, is the dissolution of the boundary between news and opinion that I see in newspapers, online, and over the air. The Washington Post is one of the worst offenders here. When I look at its website, half the time I don't know whether I'm reading a report of a political development or a comment on why it's good for the Democrats or bad for the Republicans. And I'm a liberal Democrat. Worse yet, the Sun now shares news content with the Washington Post. In my day, and I'm being the old geezer here, the Post was our main competition for state news. We would barely share the time day with them. Actually, we drank a lot together, after work, but that was the sum of it. Well, that's enough ranting for now. I'd like to finish up with a story about a famous Republican president who was convinced that the media were out to get him. He complained about fake news in the newspapers. Every day he would get more and more incensed about the coverage of his administration, as well as incessant personal attacks and salacious stories about his personal conduct. At one point, he actually suggested putting some of the more enterprising journalists in jail. And he had this enemies list. Now, I shouldn't have to tell you who I'm talking about here. It was Thomas Jefferson, the same president who once wrote, "Were I to decide whether we would have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." What changed his mind? Well, the nice things he said about newspapers were written in 1787, and all the nasty stuff came after he was elected and realized that the press was not his friend. So nothing really changes. I thank you all for your time, and if you want to feel better about the state of the world, search Google for some cute cat videos. There are a few million of them out there. Thank you.
Thank
Any
you, Mike.
questions?
That was a great program. And everybody, you can unmute yourselves if you'd like. And if you have a question for Mike or any comments, please feel free to. I should have you all on the screen here in gallery view. I'm going to. Okay, everybody. If you want to put your picture up, fine. If not, if you just have a question for Mike, let me just make mea culpa first. Mike was very generous in his compliments and how far I've come technologically. I didn't quite come far enough for this event. Mike sent me his PowerPoint presentation shortly before the meeting began, and I had it downloaded and everything was good to go. I tried to share it on the screen with all of you, and for the life of me, I could not find the file. I kept looking, and finally, about 5 minutes ago, I realized that the page that has all my PowerPoints on it had to be scrolled up one notch. When I scrolled it up, there was Mike's video and PowerPoint presentation, and obviously it was too late to put it up for you. So thank you, Mike, for your compliments. I still have a long way to go.
Well, I appreciate it, and the PowerPoint presentation was not a great loss because I just ran out of hours. And
it was very good, and unfortunately, as I say, I just didn't look far enough down the list to find it. But thanks anyway. So whoever has a question, if you want to turn your mics on, please do, and you're welcome to ask Mike. Anybody?
I just want to say, Mike, I think we all realize how long it took you to prepare for this and put all that information together and research it and put it together. And I think we all appreciate it. It was very, very informative. Some of it hit home for me. I used to work at a television station, and Annie and my eldest son teaches journalism at a high school. And he used to be a producer and assignment editor at a television station. And so all this kind of rings home.
Well, I found that in television and radio, it's the producers who do the work. The guy who delivers the news probably hasn't just seen it 5 minutes before, but there's somebody, a producer who probably isn't as pretty or doesn't have a deep voice, but is pretty smart, was out there getting the story for him.
Anybody else have a question or a
Hey,
comment?
Richard. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you. You want to put your screen on and we can see you too, but if not,
Yeah, I'm not sure why I don't have the screen on. I have mute start video.
no. I mean,
No, what?
you just got to start your video. That's all. You should have a little camera down in the corner. Whatever. So go ahead and ask your
It's
question.
okay, I see it.
No, I thank you for your talk and interesting. One of the things that we are all aware of today, I just read something. Gallup had a poll that said that 82% of people feel that news outlets are deliberately misrepresenting the facts and making them up entirely. How do we get to a point where it's on both sides? I'm on the right side, I'm not on the left side. I've grown up and, seeing things in different ways than others. But, finding this, how are we going to go forward and join as, people where we have 5, 6 of us, judging news outlets and not feeling that they're being honest, being they're opinionated or not even giving the facts?
Well, this feeling has some basis in fact, but it is also part of a long-running effort, particularly by the Republican Party, to discredit what it believes is a democratic-oriented press. And
Microphone, share video.
Please.
There we are.
I can't speak for every news organization, but the outlets I read and the one I worked for made every possible effort to produce fair and accurate news. On the Sun, every story was read by the assignment editor, by the section editor, by a copy editor, by the copy editor's boss, and then often by the managing editor, and occasionally the publisher if he thought he might get sued. But an awful lot of care was taken to make sure that that story was solid. Now, in a lot of places, there's none of that anymore. The guy writes a story, an editor looks at it, it goes online over the air. But if you look at those papers I talked about, they still have that, they still have that sense of
Put your closer eyes. And closer.
not fair. It's not necessarily fairness, but that sense of professional responsibility to produce what is the truth. It's Trump sits there every day and says the press is out to get me. It's a bunch of radical anarchists.
You said Jefferson, who was a Democrat, and Lincoln, who was a Republican, had all the same ideas. I think they like having a foil.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm thinking about, there's this young man who was at some sort of right to life thing, and there was an Indian who was hitting a drum, and there's lawsuits now, and they seem to be running into the millions of dollars against a number of news outlets. There seems to be a price to pay when you do go up to the other
It is.
side
Yeah, right.
reporting things.
Do it here. I won't do it here.
Greenberg's, hold off, please, until he's done. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't understand who is suing whom.
There was a young man from a Catholic high school, I forget his name, but he stood there in a protest, and an Indian came up to him, American Indian,
Oh.
and in that type of thing, a lot of the press reported that he was instigating things, and instead, he showed that he wasn't by showing the entire film, and he's won millions against CNN, I think the Washington Post. So there is a price to pay when you do make a mistake.
Yeah, well, I don't know who did that clip, but I can guarantee you that the Washington Post editors would have seen it in context, because one of the big issues with video is context. So, but you know, I really don't know much about that particular incident. I do know that a right-wing organization sent some people undercover into a women's health abortion clinic and came out with some film that, you know, made it look like they were pressuring them, and it made this huge impact on, you know, on the web and particularly among the right wing. And then somebody got their hands on the actual feed, that what they'd recorded, and it turned out they went in under false pretenses and basically edited it so everything they edited made it look like the clinic was doing something other than it was really doing. And I think they got sued, and of course they didn't have any money, but so they couldn't get paid. But basically they that was a clear case. It was a clear case of probably slander, because it involved words. Libel, by the way, is print, and slander is words. But it's the same idea, but one involves the printed word and the other spoken.
Can we go on to another question? Hank or Nancy, did you have a question? So get to turn your mic on. Turn your mic on, because we can't hear you. Okay,
Now do it.
go ahead.
Saying how much we have enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm glad you did.
Anybody else? Irene or anybody else?
Yes, I do.
All right.
Yes.
See the
You,
Hirsch. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned earlier about some of the stations and newspapers that had quite a slant to them rather than being unbiased. Are there, aside from newspapers, if we go to radio, we go to television, which of the stations would you call to be the least biased and giving both sides of issues? Now, I've always thought maybe NPR or PBS, you know, might be those. Would you consider those to be unbiased stations?
Yes and no. The paper I read every day and pay for a lot for the joy of a paper is the Wall Street Journal. Now that's owned by Rupert Murdoch, you know, who is this anathema to the rest of the press. But surprisingly, he did not trash that paper. They had a lot of cutbacks in reporting because the money wasn't coming in, but he actually made great improvements to that paper to make it, when I say more balanced, he improved its treatment of the arts and of literature and long form pieces about world affairs. They tend to lean slightly to the right, which is why I like them, because I want to see how intelligent conservatives, what are they really thinking? That does not apply to the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, which is somewhere to the right of Attila the Hun. But we tend to watch PBS, the PBS NewsHour on TV.
Yes, as do.
But even I find that is, I find that when I say slanted to the left, it tends to go to, it presents both sides, but it tends to go to the progressive talking heads. Although it does, I think it does its best to get Republicans and conservatives, but a lot of them won't even go on because they'd be getting hard questions, and they really don't want to answer those questions on the air. So that's what that's who I watch, and that's the newspaper I read. I also read the New York Times online and the local papers, and I read the Baltimore Sun, of course, because I gave it 34 years of my life. So anyway, by the way, and I want to say a thing about fairness or slant or whatever. In England and in Europe, there is a whole different model of reporting and presenting the news. In newspapers there are still aligned with political parties or at least movements, so that you know when you read the Times of London, it's a Tory newspaper. When you read the Guardian, it's a left-leaning newspaper. And that's up front. I mean, you know who they are and you know why they're saying what they do. When you try to do everything straight down the middle, all you get is this he said, she said, without any context, without any history. It's just so much, arguing with each other. How would you know which side is right? So what happens is one side, a paper that leans one way or the other, will tend to show you something that would back up their worldview or argument. And there are some people who believe that without a point of view, news is, news and facts are just so much, so much babble. And to tell you the truth, I'm beginning to think that the European model is better because it's upfront and it's much more fun to read and much more fun to listen to. The whole British political system is much rougher than ours until Trump. If you've ever watched the House of Commons question the Prime Minister, I mean, it gets pretty nasty, and he has to sit up there and take it. So their news interviewers tend to have a little more attitude too. They'll press issues. If they ask a question and somebody gives them an answer to some different question because that's what he's pushing, they'll say, "You didn't answer my question. Now let's try again." So that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that I like. So after all these years, thinking about objectivity, I'm beginning to think that you still have to be accurate, but you can have a point of view. By the way, Fox News, if you ever saw it, used to say its motto was fair and accurate. Okay, it said that with under the flag at every show. It took that away in 2017. It no longer says that.
But how do you account for the fact that even this past week, I think it was reported that Fox News has the highest rating of any show at all, even normal primetime showing?
You have to have a balance, I think. You can't have all liberal and you can't have all conservative. And that's why there's talk radio, and that's why there is Fox News. Somebody
Right.
for an opening to have a different point of view.
You have Fox News on one side, and then you have all the other networks on the other. So they have a big audience
Exactly.
because they have the Trump audience,
You have a captive audience, right?
right? And the other networks and outlets don't. There's no national conservative paper except for the Wall Street Journal. And to tell you the truth, I don't think most of Trump's voters are literate enough to even understand that. I mean, it's a
Yeah, let's stay away from the deep politics. Bob Hirsch and Amy had their mic off for a moment there. Did you,
I know Amy's there.
anybody have the Hirsches? Do you have a question? Guess not.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you again, Mike. It was very interesting. Again, I apologize for not being able to post your PowerPoint, but I did learn a lesson. And like you said, we constantly learn in this business, don't we?
Well, that's how I learned to do things. Trial and error, mostly error.
Okay. Again, thank you very much. And I'm going to end the event right now. And thank you all for attending.
Okay.